Virgil Mast's wife Carol kept one number for 32 years. She never showed it to anyone. She just added to it every year. The number was the gap between what the insurance companies said the broken machines were worth, and what Virgil actually got when he fixed them. After 32 years, the number was $4.7 million. In 2017, an insurance company executive stood in front of the Farm Bureau and told the room that Virgil's assessment method was subjective, undocumented, not to be trusted. He said this without ever asking to see Carol's records. 2 years later, the biggest flood in 67 years hit Nebraska. The insurance companies wrote off the equipment and moved on. Virgil moved in. What happened next is why Carol finally showed someone the number. Water and iron have a relationship that is older than farming and more patient than any farmer. Iron does not fear water in the short term. A machine caught in a rainstorm, or driven through a creek crossing, or left in the field overnight in heavy dew, does not become a different machine by morning. The iron is the same iron. The tolerances are the same tolerances. The bearings spin with the same clearance they had before the water came. But water that stays, water that finds its way into the sealed spaces, into the bearing housings and the gear cavities and the electrical connectors and the spaces between machine surfaces that were designed to be dry, that water begins a conversation with iron that is slow and specific and, if left uninterrupted, final. The conversation is called oxidation. Farmers call it rust. Engineers call it corrosion. In the language of insurance adjusters, it is called total loss. Virgil Mast had spent 43 years listening to that conversation and learning where it was going and whether it could be interrupted. He was 64 years old in the spring of 2019, and he had been buying flooded and wrecked and written off farm equipment since 1987, and he had learned, through the specific education of taking apart things that other people had given up on, that the conversation between water and iron was almost never as far along as the person who had given up on it believed. Almost never. In the spring of 2019, when the Missouri River broke its banks and covered 300,000 acres of Nebraska farmland with the worst flood since 1952, the insurance companies wrote off $340 million in agricultural equipment and moved on. One of the men who had spent years telling the agricultural community that operations like Virgil's were not to be trusted was named Craig Ellison, and he was the regional supervisor for Heartland Mutual Agricultural Insurance Company, and he had said specific things at a Nebraska Farm Bureau Equipment Summit in 2017. Things about recovery market operators and their standards and the reliability of equipment that had passed through their hands. Virgil had heard what Ellison said. He had not responded. He drove his flatbed trailer to the edge of the floodwater and waited for it to go down. This is the story of what he found when it did. The bomb cyclone arrived on a Wednesday, which was the worst possible day for a weather event of that magnitude. Worst possible because the Missouri River was already running high from an early snowmelt, and a rapidly deepening low-pressure system crossing the Rockies would produce exactly the combination of precipitation and snowmelt acceleration that the levee systems along the river had not been tested against in 67 years. The Weather Service had been tracking the system for 4 days. The forecasts were specific. The outcome, in broad terms, was predictable. What was not predictable was the exact geography of destruction. Which fields would be underwater by Thursday morning and which by Friday, which levees would hold and which would not, which pieces of equipment would have time to be moved to high ground and which would not. Virgil Mast had been watching the forecast for 4 days from his farm in Louisville, Nebraska, which sat on slightly elevated ground east of the town and which the models suggested would be spared the worst. The models were right. His ground stayed dry. His neighbors were less fortunate. By Friday evening, March 15, 2019, approximately 300,000 acres of Nebraska cropland were underwater. The photographs and videos that circulated on social media showed a landscape that looked less like Nebraska and more like a shallow inland sea, grain bins standing to their rooflines in brown water, farmsteads islanded by floodwater, and scattered across the inundated fields, the shapes of farm equipment that had not been moved in time or could not be moved. Combines. Grain carts. Tractors. Planters. Spreaders. Machines worth, at retail replacement cost, somewhere between $150, and $500, each, sitting in contaminated floodwater that worked its way into every unsealed space it could find. The insurance companies arrived quickly. They were efficient. They had protocols for this kind of event, trained adjusters with tablet computers and standard assessment criteria and the specific calculus of flood damage to agricultural equipment. Water submersion above the engine/transmission level equals total loss, full stop, write a check and move on. Virgil drove his flatbed trailer to the edge of the receding floodwater and waited. The Nebraska Farm Bureau held an agricultural equipment summit in Grand Island in the fall of 2017, an annual gathering of farmers, equipment dealers, insurance professionals, and agricultural lenders that address the financial and operational aspects of farm equipment ownership. Craig Ellison had been invited to present on agricultural equipment insurance best practices. He was 49 years old, 14 years with Heartland Mutual, the last 6 as regional supervisor for the Nebraska-Iowa territory. He was a careful, organized man who had built his professional reputation on the consistency and rigor of his claims operations, and he spoke about insurance with the authority of someone who had processed thousands of claims and had arrived at a clear understanding of how the system worked. His presentation covered standard equipment valuation methods, total loss assessment protocols, and, in a section that generated the most discussion, the secondary equipment market and what Ellison called non-standard restoration operations. "There's a segment of the used equipment market," Ellison said, standing at the podium with his presentation behind him, "that we classify internally as recovery market operators. These are individuals or small operations that buy damaged or written-off equipment and attempt to restore it to service." He advanced to the next slide. "From an insurance standpoint, equipment that has passed through recovery market operations presents specific challenges. The restoration work is not performed by certified technicians. It is not documented to manufacturer standards. It is not covered by any warranty. And the assessment methodology used to determine whether a machine is restorable is," he paused, "subjective. It depends on the experience and judgment of one person, in one shop, with no external validation." He advanced to the next slide. Heartland Mutual has processed 17 claims involving equipment that was represented as restored by recovery market operators over the past 5 years. In 11 of those cases, we found undisclosed pre-existing damage. In 4 of those cases, the machines failed within 18 months of restoration and required significant additional repair. Recovery market equipment is a known risk category, and I would advise everyone in this room to approach it accordingly. A farmer from Platte County named Roy Timken raised his hand. "You're talking about operations like Virgil Mast's in Louisville?" Ellison had heard of Virgil Mast, had encountered his operation in the context of several claims over the years. "Mr. Mast's operation is one example," he said. "There are several in the region." "Virgil Mast has been fixing equipment for 30 years, Timken said. "I've bought 2 machines from him. Both of them are still running." "I'm not commenting on specific operations," Ellison said. "I'm describing a risk category." He moved to the next slide. "The fundamental issue is documentation and standardization. A machine's restoration value depends on what was done to it and how it was done, and recovery market operations do not produce documentation that allows those questions to be answered with confidence." Virgil Mast was in the room. He was sitting in the 7th row, because he was a Farm Bureau member and attended most of the regional summits. He had not been forewarned that recovery market operators would be discussed, and he was hearing the characterization of his work, and the work of his father and grandfather before him, as undocumented, unvalidated, subjectively assessed, and constituting a known risk category. He did not stand up. He did not respond. He looked at the presentation and thought about what had been said and what the evidence for it was, and he concluded that the 17 claims Ellison had cited were real and that the undisclosed damage was real and that the failed restorations were real, but that the inference Ellison had drawn, that these outcomes characterized recovery market operations generally, was not supported by the evidence as Ellison had presented it. He drove home after the summit and told Carol what had been said. Carol was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," Virgil said. "The work is the response. When the moment comes where it matters, the work will have made the case." "When is that?" Carol said. "I don't know exactly," Virgil said. "But something will come up." Virgil Mast had grown up in the machine shop behind his father's implement dealership in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, where his father had run a Case and New Holland dealership for 32 years. He had grown up around broken machines and the specific practice of fixing them, not the warranty and parts replacement model of the modern dealership but the older model, the one in which a mechanic understood a machine well enough to take it apart completely and put it back together and have it work. His father had been that kind of mechanic. His grandfather had been that kind of mechanic. The knowledge had passed from one to the next the way this kind of knowledge always passes, not through instruction exactly but through presence, through thousands of hours in the shop watching and helping and being handed tools and being shown what a worn bearing looked and felt like and what happened to a hydraulic pump that had run with dirty fluid for too many hours. Virgil had set up his own recovery operation in 1987, not a dealership, not a standard repair shop, but something that bought broken equipment and restored it to service at prices that reflected actual mechanical condition rather than history. The operation was built on assessment accuracy, the ability to predict, before purchase, whether a machine was restorable and at what cost. This was the differentiating skill. Anyone could buy cheap damaged equipment. Only someone who could accurately predict what it would take to fix it could make the economics work consistently. Over 32 years, his assessment accuracy on flood and water damage was 87%. He had the records to prove this, every machine he had bought and assessed and the outcome of that assessment, documented in Carroll's files from the first year of the operation. When Craig Ellison had stood at the Farm Bureau podium in 2017 and called recovery market assessment subjective and characterized recovery market equipment as a known risk category, Virgil had thought about those records. About 32 years of documented outcomes. About the 2 machines Roy Timken had mentioned, which were still running, and about the dozens of other machines that had gone back into service and were still running, and about the specific, accumulated, outcome-validated knowledge that Ellison had described as having no external validation. He had not responded. He had waited. In the weeks after the March 2019 flood, as the floodwater receded across Cass County, Virgil drove the county roads and talked to farmers and looked at what was available for purchase. His criteria were specific. The machine had to have a restorable engine, stopped and not running when the water rose, not hydraulically locked from water ingestion. An engine that had ingested water was not restorable without a full rebuild that typically exceeded the economic margin. The machine had to have been submerged for a limited period. Equipment submerged for less than a week had significantly better recovery prospects than equipment submerged for 3 weeks. The difference was the progression of corrosion into sealed bearing surfaces, slow enough in the first week to be interruptible. The machine had to be a platform he knew well. He was specifically expert in Casey and John Deere combined platforms from the 1990s through the 2010s, and in Casey and John Deere tractor platforms from the same period. And the price had to make sense. The insurance companies had paid settlement checks to the farmers, transferring the total loss determination and the machine title to the farmers in exchange for the settlement. Virgil was buying the salvage titles from the farmers at the settlement value, which was typically 13 to 25% of the machine's pre-flood market value. He bought 11 machines. Combined acquisition cost, $187,000. He spent 6 months restoring them. 9 ran. 2 could not be recovered economically, a Casey 8240 that had been running when the water hit and had hydraulically locked the engine, and a John Deere 9570 that had been submerged for 19 days with its grain tank hatch open, allowing corrosion to progress too far into the drive shafts to be addressable within the economic margin. Both were parted out, recovering $34,000 in components. The 9 recovered machines had a combined resale value of approximately $1.4 million. Carol Mast had been managing the operation's finances since 1987, and she understood its economics precisely. The margin came from 2 sources: assessment accuracy, which meant buying the right machines, and execution speed, which meant restoring them faster than the market expected. Assessment accuracy was Virgil's skill. Execution speed was the shop's discipline. Carol tracked both with the same precise attention she brought to everything financial. She had been tracking something else since 1987 as well: the cumulative gap between what the insurance companies paid for machines that Virgil subsequently recovered and what those machines were actually worth recovered. She had calculated this number for every major recovery event: the 1993 Mississippi floods, the 2011 Missouri River flooding, the various smaller events. Over 32 years, she estimated the cumulative gap at approximately $4.7 million. This was the total value that Virgil's knowledge had found in machines that the insurance industry's framework had written off. When she heard what Craig Ellison had said at the 2017 summit, Virgil had come home and told her in the specific, compact way he told things. She had looked at this number and thought about it for a long time. He said, "Your work is subjective and undocumented," she said. He said that, Virgil said. "And our records going back to 1987 are documented outcomes from every assessment you've made." "They are," Virgil said. "He doesn't know about the records," Carol said. "He doesn't know about the records because he never asked," Virgil said. Carol looked at the 1987 binder, the oldest one, yellowed and worn, with Virgil's handwriting on every page. "He will," she said. The machine shop behind Virgil's house in Louisville had been built in stages over 32 years. The original 40 by 60 foot metal building from 1987, expanded twice to its current footprint of 120 by 80 feet with a pit, an overhead crane, a parts washer the size of a small room, and the accumulated tooling of 3 decades of agricultural equipment recovery. In October 2019, the shop held 7 of the 11 flood machines in various stages of completion, and the yard outside held the other 4, 2 running and parked, 2 awaiting final testing. Dale Whitmore, the insurance adjuster who had processed the Cass County flood claims for Heartland Mutual, drove past the shop on his way between farm visits in October and noticed the activity and asked around. What he was told was that the man at that shop had bought flood-damaged equipment and was restoring it. He stopped. He had processed 47 agricultural equipment claims in Cass County following the March flooding, totaling approximately $8.2 million in settlements, of which approximately $5.6 million was equipment total loss claims. He had done this work in 11 days, driving from farm to farm, entering parameters into the assessment software, generating settlement offers. He checked the serial numbers on 3 of the machines in Virgil's yard against the claims file on his tablet. 3 matches. Written off machines, running. He knocked on the shop door. Virgil let him in. Virgil walked Whitmore through the shop the way he walked everyone through it, methodically, without showmanship, beginning at the point where a machine arrived and ending at the point where it left. He showed Whitmore the assessment area near the shop door, where he evaluated incoming machines before committing to their recovery. He explained the criteria: engine ingestion status, submersion duration, sediment content estimate, platform-specific seal quality, bearing condition in the critical drives. He showed Whitmore the parts washer, the large industrial unit that could clean combined components down to bare metal, removing the combination of flood sediment, corrosion byproducts, and old lubricants. He showed Whitmore the current Casey 7240 in mid-disassembly, the rotor drive bearing housings opened, the bearings removed, the races and bearing surfaces under examination. The bearing surfaces are the critical question on flood damage, Virgil said. Water sitting on a machined bearing surface starts to pit it within 48 to 72 hours. Shallow pitting, surface oxidation, can be cleaned to below the functional tolerance. Deep pitting, more than about 5/1000ths of an inch, requires replacement. How do you measure it? Whitmore asked. Profilometer for the critical surfaces. Visual for the less critical ones. Virgil picked up a bearing race from the parts tray. This one has surface oxidation about 3/1000ths deep. Cleanable. The machine gets this bearing race back. Whitmore looked at the bearing race. He had been doing agricultural equipment adjustments for 11 years and had not previously held a flood-damaged bearing race while someone explained what was happening to its surface at the level of thousandths of an inch. The standard assessment framework classifies submersion above the engine/transmission level as total loss, Whitmore said carefully. The basis is that restoration cost exceeds machine value. In a standard repair shop environment, dealer rates, new parts, full warranty work, that's accurate, Virgil said. My cost structure is different. My labor rate is different. My part sourcing is different. My knowledge of which components require replacement and which can be cleaned and reused is different. How different? Virgil walked him to the whiteboard on the east wall where Carol kept the running cost tracking for the current project. The board showed acquisition cost, labor by category, parts by category, and the current total against projected resale. Whitmore read the numbers. He read them again. Your total restoration cost on the 8,120 is less than a third of the machine's resale value. Slightly under a third, Virgil said. The standard framework would have projected restoration cost at approximately 120% of resale value. Because the standard framework uses dealer labor rates and new parts, Virgil said, and because the standard framework doesn't account for the knowledge of what actually needs replacing and what doesn't. The knowledge Craig Ellison described at the 2017 summit is subjective, Whitmore said. He said it carefully, watching Virgil's face. Yes, Virgil said. That knowledge. He walked Whitmore to the filing cabinets along the south wall. He opened the bottom drawer and took out a binder. My assessment records from 1987, he said. Every machine I've assessed, the parameters of the assessment, the projected outcome, and the documented actual outcome. He set the binder on the workbench. 32 years. 87% accuracy on flood and water damage. Whitmore looked at the binder. He looked at the other binders in the drawer. He looked at Virgil. This is the external validation, he said. It's the outcome record, Virgil said. I don't know what external means in your framework. In mine, outcomes are the validation. Dale Whitmore drove back to Lincoln and wrote a report for his regional supervisor. The report described what he had seen at the mast operation in specific terms, the methodology, the cost structure, the outcome records, the results to date on the 2019 flood machines. He also included an assessment of the implications, which was the section his supervisor would find uncomfortable. If Heartland Mutual's standard total loss framework was systematically underestimating recovery potential, the company had been paying settlements on machines that were recoverable at costs below the settlement value. This was not fraud, the settlements were accurate within the framework. The framework was incomplete. He included one more observation: the 2017 summit presentation, in which Craig Ellison had characterized recovery market operations as subjective and undocumented, had been made without reference to the outcome records in Mast's filing cabinets. 32 years of documented assessment outcomes, available to anyone who had asked, had not been part of Ellison's analysis. He submitted the report and waited. Craig Ellison called him 2 days later. "How certain are you about the accuracy records?" Ellison asked. "I looked at 5 years of records in detail," Whitmore said. "They're precisely maintained. The assessment criteria are documented for each machine, the projected outcome is documented, and the actual outcome is documented with follow-up data." He paused. "They're more carefully maintained than our claims files." Ellison was quiet for a moment. "I said things at the 2017 summit about recovery market operations," he said. "You said the assessment methodology was subjective and had no external validation," Whitmore said. "I said it without having seen those records," Ellison said. "No," Whitmore said. "You did." Another silence. "Set up a meeting," Ellison said. "I need to go out there." Craig Ellison arrived at the Mast operation on a Thursday in November 2019 in a current model full-size pickup with the Heartland Mutual logo on the door. He was 51 years old, tall, with the bearing of someone who had been senior for long enough that seniority had become physical. He had done his preparation, Whitmore's report, background research on flood recovery operations, and he arrived with informed questions. But he had also arrived with something else, which was the specific discomfort of a man who knows he is about to look at evidence that contradicts a public position he has taken, and who has not yet worked out what he is going to do with that. Virgil walked him through the shop. The same tour he had given Whitmore, with the same specific focus on the assessment methodology and the cost structure and the documentation. The whiteboard with the cost tracking. The parts washer. The bearing races with their measured oxidation depths. When they got to the filing cabinets, Virgil opened the bottom drawer. "My records from 1987, Virgil said. "Every flood and water damage assessment I've made. Projected outcome. Actual outcome." Ellison pulled out the 1987 binder. He looked at Virgil's handwriting on the first page, the precise, mechanic script that documented an Iowa combined from the 1993 flood, its assessment parameters, the projected restoration, the actual result. He went through the binder slowly. Then he looked at the drawer, at the other binders representing 32 years of the same careful documentation. "You have this going back to 1987, he said. 32 years, Virgil said. "These records were available in 2017, Ellison said. "It was not a question. They were available whenever anyone wanted to look at them," Virgil said. Ellison set the binder down. He looked at the whiteboard. At the cost tracking. At the 9 machines in the yard and the shop that had been written off as total losses and were now running or close to running. "I characterized your methodology," Ellison said, "as subjective and having no external validation." "You did," Virgil said. "I made that characterization without looking at these records." "You did," Virgil said again. Ellison was quiet for a long time. Virgil waited. He had learned to wait. "I owe you a correction," Ellison said finally. "What I said at the 2017 summit was not accurate. The methodology has a 32-year outcome record that constitutes exactly the kind of validation I said it lacked." "Yes," Virgil said. "I want to talk about what that means going forward," Ellison said. "But before that," he paused. "There's a Farm Bureau winter meeting in December. The Cass County chapter. People will be asking questions about the flood settlements and what's happening with the equipment. I'm going to be there." He looked at Virgil. "I want you to be there too." "Why?" Virgil said. "Because what I said needs to be corrected in front of the same kind of audience that heard it," Ellison said. "The 2017 summit was regional. The December meeting is county. It's not the same room. But it's the same community." Virgil looked at him. This was more than he had expected. "I'll be there," he said. In December 2019, 3 weeks before the Farm Bureau meeting, Carol Mast sat at the kitchen table and did the calculation she had been building toward for months. The 11 machines. The $187,000 acquisition cost. The labor and parts costs, tracked precisely through the shop's accounting, $261,000. Total investment, $448,000. 9 recovered machines, projected resale, $1,412,000. 2 parted out, $34,000. Total revenue, $1,446,000. Net return, $998,000 over 14 months. She looked at this number. Then she did the second calculation. The insurance companies had paid settlements totaling $187,000 on equipment with a combined pre-flood value of approximately $2.1 million. The 9 recoverable machines had been sold for $1.412 million. The gap between what the insurance companies paid and what the machines were actually worth, recoverable, approximately $1.225 million on this event alone. Over 32 years, her estimate of the cumulative gap was approximately $4.7 million. She brought the full calculation to Virgil. He read the numbers without saying anything for a while. "You've been adding these up for 33 years, he said. "Not as carefully as this," Carol said. "But yes." "What did you do with the number?" he said. "I kept farming," she said. He looked at her. "That's what I did too," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why we're still here." She had also brought the calculation for a different reason. "The Farm Bureau meeting," she said. "When Ellison makes his correction, I want you to have the full numbers." "Why?" Virgil said. "Because the correction should include what the incomplete framework actually cost," Carol said. "Not just on this event. Over time." She put the calculation on the table between them. "This is the arithmetic of the gap. It belongs in the room." The Cass County Farm Bureau held its winter meeting on the first Thursday of December 2019, at the Agricultural Center in Plattsmouth. Larger than usual attendance, 67 farmers, several equipment dealers, 2 extension agents, and Craig Ellison, who had called ahead to be on the agenda and who arrived early and sat at the front of the room, which was where he had placed himself deliberately. Not in the back row managing the situation from a distance, but at the front, visible. Dale Whitmore was in the back row with his tablet computer. Virgil Mast was in the 4th row with a manila folder that contained Carol's calculation and the 1987 binder. The regular business of the meeting took 40 minutes. Then Ellison stood up. He had not been introduced by the program. He had simply stood up when the chair opened the floor, and the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they sense that something significant is about to be said. "My name is Craig Ellison," he said. "I'm the regional supervisor for Heartland Mutual Agricultural Insurance Company. I want to address something directly before the questions I know are coming." He described the standard total loss framework, accurately, without softening. He described what Dale Whitmore's visit to the Mast operation had found. He described the gap between the standard framework and the recovery market that Virgil Mast represented. Then he said, "In 2017, at the Nebraska Farm Bureau Equipment Summit in Grand Island, I gave a presentation on agricultural equipment insurance. In that presentation, I characterized recovery market operations like Virgil Mast's, as relying on subjective assessment methodology with no external validation. I said that recovery market equipment was a known risk category." He paused. That characterization was not accurate. The room was very quiet. Mr. Mast has maintained outcome records for every assessment he has made since 1987. 32 years of documented results, assessment parameters, projected outcomes, actual outcomes. His assessment accuracy on flood and water damage over that period is 87%. Those records constitute exactly the kind of external validation I said was absent. He looked directly at Virgil. "I made that statement without having looked at those records. I should have looked before I spoke." A farmer named Gerald Haas, who farmed 100 acres in the northern part of the county and who had lost a Casey 8240 combine in the March flooding and received a settlement check for it, raised his hand. "Mr. Ellison," Gerald said. "My neighbor Tom Brecht bought my combine from me after the settlement. He sold it to Virgil Mast in Louisville. Virgil's got it running. It's on Tom's brother's farm over in Ottaway County right now, in the field." The room produced the particular sound of people who have been holding something for several months and are now releasing it. "I want to understand," Gerald said, "how a machine that was written off as a total loss is running." "Your machine was assessed by our standard framework as uneconomical to restore in a standard repair environment," Ellison said. "That assessment was accurate in its own terms. What it didn't account for was Mr. Mast's operation, which can restore machines at significantly lower cost than the standard framework assumes. In Mr. Mast's environment, your machine was not a total loss." "So the settlement was wrong," Gerald said. "The settlement was accurate within the framework," Ellison said. The framework was incomplete. He paused. Those are different things. But I understand that the difference doesn't fully address your question. Gerald Haas was still standing. What does address my question? Ellison looked at him. Then he looked at Virgil. Virgil stood up. He had the manila folder in his hand. He opened it to Carol's calculation and held up the single sheet of paper. I want to show you something, he said. This is my wife Carol's calculation of what the incomplete framework cost, not just in this flood, but over 32 years of recovery market operations in this region. He read the numbers. The $4. 7 million cumulative gap. The $1. 225 million on the 2019 event alone. The $187,000 Heartland Mutual had paid on machines worth $2. 1 million. The room was very quiet. I'm not saying this is fraud, Virgil said. I'm saying this is what happens when an assessment framework doesn't include the knowledge of what's actually possible. The knowledge existed. I've had it for 32 years. Nobody asked. He looked at Ellison. Now they're asking. A farmer in the second row, Roy Timken, from Platte County, who had been at the 2017 summit when Ellison made the original characterization, said, Mr. Ellison. You said in 2017 that recovery market equipment was a known risk category. Is that still your position? Ellison looked at him. No, he said. I withdraw that characterization. Equipment restored by an operation with documented assessment accuracy and proper methodology is not categorically a higher risk than dealer-restored equipment. He paused. I should not have made a categorical statement about a category I had not adequately investigated. Roy Timken nodded once and sat down. The discussion that followed ran for 50 minutes. Farmers asked specific questions about their own settlements, about the assessment methodology, about what the revised framework would mean for future events. Ellison answered what he could answer and deferred what he needed to defer. After the meeting, in the parking lot in the December cold, Ellison found Virgil loading the manila folder into his truck. The calculation your wife did, Ellison said. 4.7 million over 32 years. Yes, Virgil said. I want that in the revised framework documentation, Ellison said. Not as an indictment, as the historical basis for why the framework needed revision. Virgil looked at him for a moment. This was more than he had expected, and more than he had asked for. Talk to Carol, Virgil said. She kept the records. The consultation agreement between Virgil Mast and Heartland Mutual Agricultural Insurance Company was finalized in February 2020. It covered 4 things. First, Heartland Mutual would engage Virgil as a consulting assessor on flood and water damage claims involving Casey and John Deere combine and tractor platforms from 1995 through the current model year. His fee would be per assessment, structured to reflect complexity and extent of damage. Second, Heartland Mutual would revise its standard total loss framework for agricultural equipment flood damage to include a recovery market assessment, an evaluation of whether damaged equipment was likely to be restorable at costs below the insured value in the recovery market environment. Third, the revised framework documentation would include a formal acknowledgement that the standard total loss classification had been based on dealer rate restoration cost assumptions that did not reflect the actual recovery market, and that this had resulted in the classification of recoverable equipment as total losses. Fourth, Virgil's specific requirement, which had caused the most discussion, Carol's 32-year gap calculation would be included in the revised framework's historical basis section, with attribution to the Mast recovery operation records from 1987 to 2019. Ellison had not pushed back on this. After the Farm Bureau meeting, after Roy Timken's pointed question and the room full of farmers and the precise accounting of what the incomplete framework had cost over 32 years, he had understood that the historical record was going to be part of the story regardless of what the framework documentation said. Better to have it accurate. Carol had spent 2 weeks preparing the documentation, the full outcome records from 1987, organized for external review, with the methodology explanation that Virgil had drafted and that she had edited for clarity. When she handed the documentation to Ellison's team, she included a cover note that read, "These records were available to anyone who asked at any time since 1987. They were not asked for until 2019. Ellison kept the cover note in the claims file. Dale Whitmore had driven to Virgil's shop in October 2019 as part of his professional responsibility. He drove back in February and March 2020 because he wanted to. He had spent 4 days in the shop in early 2020, working on actual machines. Not learning the full methodology, he understood that 32 years of accumulated knowledge could not be transferred in 4 days. What he was learning was the structure, what questions to ask, what indicators to look for, where the standard assessment framework was most likely to be wrong and by how much. On the second day, he was given a specific task. Virgil put him in front of a disassembled rotor drive from a Casey 2388 combine, one that had been flood damaged in Iowa and was in the shop for evaluation, and asked him to assess the bearing races for oxidation depth using the profilometer and Virgil's written criteria. Whitmore worked through the assessment. He measured 7 bearing races and categorized each as cleanable or replacement required. He wrote his conclusions on the assessment form. Then Virgil looked at his work. 4 of the 7 were correct, 3 were wrong. Whitmore had classified 2 cleanable races as replacement required, and 1 replacement required race as cleanable. This one, Virgil picked up the race Whitmore had classified as cleanable, is at 6 thousandths. Your measurement was accurate. But look at where the pitting is concentrated. He showed Whitmore the bearing surface under the magnifying lamp. The pitting is clustered at the highest load contact zone. At 6 thousandths uniform depth, this would be cleanable. At 6 thousandths concentrated in the high load zone, the effective depth under load is higher. This one needs replacement. Whitmore looked at the bearing surface under the lamp. He could see what Virgil was describing. The concentration of oxidation at the contact zone was visible once Virgil had pointed to it. I wouldn't have seen that without knowing to look for it, Whitmore said. You'll see it now, Virgil said. Because you've seen it. That's how the library grows. He showed Whitmore the 2 races he had incorrectly classified as replacement required. In both cases, the oxidation depth at the measurement point had been at the upper edge of the cleanable range, and Whitmore had been conservative. In this range, Virgil indicated the 5 to 6 thousandths zone. The decision depends on the load profile of the specific application. This bearing position in the 2388 rotor drive runs a moderate load profile. In a higher load application, I'd replace it. Here, it's cleanable. How do you know the load profile? Whitmore asked. 32 years of 2388 rotor drives, Virgil said. That's not in a manual. Is it in your records? Some of it. The failure rate data by bearing position is in the records. You can infer the load profile from the failure patterns. Virgil set the race down. The records tell you what failed. The knowledge tells you why. You can get to some of the why from the records if you look at them carefully enough. Whitmore had looked at them carefully enough, over the subsequent months, to build the structural understanding Virgil had described, enough to know what the standard assessment was missing and approximately how much. His claims handling accuracy on flood damage events improved significantly after the 2020 shop sessions. He still came back quarterly. Because the records told you what failed, and the knowledge told you why, and the quarterly sessions were how he kept the connection between the two. Trey Soonstrom had grown up on a farm in Saunders County and had a diesel mechanics degree from Southeast Community College and had heard about Virgil Mast's flood recovery operation from his uncle, who farmed near Louisville. He showed up at the shop in June 2021, 24 years old, and asked for a job. Virgil had hired people before. Most of them had lasted less than a year, because the work was specific and demanding in ways that were hard to predict from the outside. The hours were long, the problem solving was continuous, and the tolerance for uncertainty was high. You had to be comfortable working on a machine that you didn't fully understand, with a methodology that was partly written down and partly not, toward an outcome that was projected but not guaranteed. Trey lasted the first month without complaint. At the end of the first month, Virgil gave him his first solo assessment, a John Deere 9470 that had been caught in spring flooding in eastern Iowa, submersion duration approximately 5 days, engine stopped before the water rose. Trey spent 3 hours on the assessment and produced a written report: engine restorable, rotor drive bearings in cleanable range, feeder house drive replaceable, electrical system complete rebuild required, grain tank unloading system. He paused in his written report and wrote, uncertain, requires further disassembly to assess. Virgil read the report and then told Trey to proceed with the further disassembly on the grain tank unloading system. What Trey found was a problem that his initial assessment had correctly flagged as uncertain. The grain tank auger lower bearing had been submerged at the lowest point of the machine, had been in contact with the highest sediment floodwater, and had developed oxidation that was at the exact boundary between cleanable and replacement required. The profilometer read 4.8 thousandths at the primary measurement point and 6.2 thousandths at a secondary point that Trey had almost missed. He brought Virgil in. Virgil looked at the measurements. He looked at the bearing surface under the magnifying lamp. He ran his thumbnail across the surface, a gesture that Trey had seen him make dozens of times and that he had not yet been able to replicate with the same diagnostic intent. The secondary measurement is the governing one, Virgil said. The primary point is in the moderate load zone for this bearing position. The secondary point is in the high load zone. He showed Trey where the high load zone was, and why. When the auger is running at capacity, which it does during the last pass of a heavy yield field, this is where the contact stress concentrates. At 6/2000ths in this zone, you're looking at accelerated wear within 200 to 300 operating hours. Replace it, Trey said. Replace it, Virgil confirmed. Trey replaced the bearing. The 9470 went back to service in Iowa 4 months later. It was still running 18 months after that. Trey's first-year assessment accuracy on flood and water damage, 71%. His second-year accuracy, 79%. Virgil had projected 85% within 5 years. At the end of his first year, Trey had asked, "How do I get from 79 to 85? You open more machines," Virgil said. "You see what you predicted and what you actually found. The gap between those two things is your curriculum." "Is there a shortcut?" "No," Virgil said. "But there's a faster path. Every time you're wrong, you write down why. Not just what, why. The why is what closes the gap." Trey had been writing down why since the beginning of his first year. The notebook was already half full. The documentation that Carroll prepared for the revised framework included 32 years of assessment records organized into 5 categories: flood and water damage, fire damage, rollover and structural damage, crop system failures, and general mechanical failures. The flood and water damage records were the most detailed, 847 assessments over 32 years, with the full parameter set for each assessment and the documented outcome. Virgil's overall accuracy on this category was 87%, but the records showed something more granular than that. Accuracy varied by platform, by submersion duration, and by engine type in ways that the 87% summary statistic concealed. On Casey combined platforms from the 1995 to 2010 model years, his accuracy was 91%. On John Deere combined platforms from the same period, 88%. On older platforms, pre-1995, his accuracy was 93%, reflecting the deeper platform knowledge that came from having worked on those machines from their introduction. On machines with submersion durations under 72 hours, his accuracy was 94%. On machines with submersion durations of 72 hours to 7 days, 86%. On machines with submersion durations over 7 days, 71%. This granularity was what Whitmore had described as more carefully maintained than our claims files, and it was what Ellison's team had incorporated into the revised framework's assessment criteria. The revised criteria did not attempt to replicate Virgil's full methodology, that was not possible in a document. What they did was provide adjusters with the primary indicators that distinguish likely recoverable from likely unrecoverable machines, the engine ingestion question, the submersion duration windows, and the platform-specific seal quality ratings that Virgil had developed from the 32-year outcome record. It was not Virgil's knowledge. It was a better approximation of Virgil's knowledge than the standard framework had been. When Carroll showed Virgil the final version of the revised criteria, he read through them carefully and said, "This is about 40% of what I do. The other 60% is what lives in you," Carroll said. "Yes," Virgil said. "Then the other 60% needs to find somewhere else to live," Carroll said. "Before you retire." "I'm not retiring," Virgil said. "Eventually," Carroll said. "Everyone does." In the spring of 2022, Gerald Haas drove to the mast operation in Louisville and asked to talk. He was 67 years old and had been farming in Cass County for 43 years and had the direct communication style of a man who did not have patience for circuitousness. Virgil took him into the shop office and Carroll made coffee. "I've been thinking about what happened at the Farm Bureau meeting," Gerald said. "When I asked you why you didn't tell anyone you could fix them." "I remember," Virgil said. "Your answer was that the work is the response," Gerald said. And then you read Carroll's calculation. The 4.7 million over 32 years. "Yes. I've been thinking about what that means," Gerald said. "That number is money that the insurance companies paid out on machines that were actually worth more. It's also, in a way, money that I didn't get. Money that went to you instead of me." Virgil looked at him. "Yes," he said. "You could have told people," Gerald said. "You could have called farmers when you bought their write-off checks and told them what you thought you could do with the machine." "I could have," Virgil said. "Why didn't you?" Virgil was quiet for a moment. It was a genuine question and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because I was operating a business," he said. "The information asymmetry, knowing what the machines were worth and having the market not know it, that was the margin. I used it the way any business person uses an information advantage. He paused. I'm not sure that was wrong. But I understand why it doesn't feel right from where you're sitting. What would have felt right? Gerald said. I should have called you directly, Virgil said. When I bought the machine. I should have told you what I thought I could do with it and offered you a share of the recovery margin. That's what I should have done. Why didn't you? Because I'd been doing it the other way for 30 years, Virgil said. It didn't occur to me to change the arrangement. That's not an excuse. It's the honest answer. Gerald looked at his coffee cup. Ellison said at the meeting that the framework was incomplete, he said. He said that's different from wrong. It is different, Virgil said. Is it different enough? Gerald said. Virgil thought about this. I don't know, he said. The framework was incomplete because nobody in the insurance industry had the knowledge to make it complete. That knowledge existed, it was in my shop for 32 years. But it wasn't asked for, and I didn't offer it, and the gap stayed open. He paused. If I had been more forthcoming, if I had gone to the Farm Bureau myself in 2010 or 2015 and said, here is what the incomplete framework is costing, the gap might have closed sooner. Why didn't you? Gerald said. Same reason as before, Virgil said. The gap was the margin. Gerald Haas was quiet for a long time. You fixed my combine, he said finally. It's running on a farm in Ottaway County. It'll probably run for another 10 years. He looked at Virgil. That's worth something. Yes, Virgil said. And you corrected the framework, Gerald said. So what happened to me won't happen the same way to the next person. That's what the consultation agreement is for, Virgil said. Fix the framework, Gerald said. That's what you did. That's what we're doing, Virgil said. We're not done. Craig Ellison called Virgil in October 2022, 2 years after the consultation agreement. He had been promoted to division director in January, a larger territory, more staff, more responsibility. He was calling, he said, to report on how the revised framework was performing. The framework had been applied in 2 significant flood events in 2021 and 2022, covering Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. Total equipment claims, 143. Under the old framework, approximately 89% would have been classified as total losses. Under the revised framework, 71% were classified as total losses and 29% were referred for recovery market assessment, either to Virgil or to 2 other operations that had been identified and vetted using the same outcome record methodology. Of the machines referred for recovery market assessment, 84% had been successfully recovered. What does that mean in dollar terms? Virgil asked. Ellison gave him the number. The revised framework had produced savings, in settlement payments on machines that had been recovered rather than written off, of approximately $2. 1 million across the 2 events. Against the consulting fees? Virgil said. The consulting fees are approximately 8% of the savings, Ellison said. And the 17 cases you cited at the 2017 summit, Virgil said. The ones with undisclosed damage and failed restorations. Are you still seeing those? We're seeing them less frequently, Ellison said. The vetting process for recovery market assessors, the outcome record requirement that your records established as the standard, is filtering the operations that were generating those cases. They were real cases, Virgil said. I don't want you to think I disputed that. I know, Ellison said. They were real cases from operations that didn't maintain the outcome records. The records are what distinguishes the methodology from what I described in 2017. He paused. I should have made that distinction in 2017. I described a risk category without distinguishing between operations with documented methodology and operations without it. That was the error. The distinction was available, Virgil said. Anyone who had asked would have found it. Yes, Ellison said. They were quiet for a moment. How is the apprenticeship? Ellison asked. Trey is at 82% and climbing, Virgil said. He'll be running the shop on his own within 2 years. He's got the records, he's got the methodology, and he's got the sense to know when he's in the 18%. The 18%? The part he'll miss, Virgil said. He writes down why. That's how you get from 82 to 90. Carol Mast retired from the formal accounting in the fall of 2023, handing the books to Trey's wife Andrea, who had an accounting degree from Nebraska and who had spent 6 months learning the filing system before Carol considered her ready. Before she handed over the books, Carol made one addition to the filing system, a new folder at the front of the 2019 binder, labeled in her precise handwriting. Before you start. The folder contained 3 documents. The first was the cover sheet from the consultation agreement, the page that listed the 4 elements of the agreement and, in particular, the 4th element, Carol's 32-year gap calculation included in the revised framework documentation, with attribution to the mass recovery operation records from 1987 to 2019. The second was Carol's note to Ellison's team from February 2020. These records were available to anyone who asked at any time since 1987. They were not asked for until 2019. The third was a single page, handwritten, that Carol had written in December 2019, the night after the Farm Bureau meeting. It read, "The gap between what the framework said and what the machines were actually worth is $4.7 million over 32 years. This is not an accusation. It is the arithmetic of what happens when knowledge that exists in one place is not connected to decisions being made in another place. The connection takes time and requires someone willing to look." Craig Ellison looked in October 2019. He looked because Dale Whitmore looked in October 2019. Whitmore looked because 9 written-off machines were running in the fields of Cass County. The machines ran because of the work. The work was always the argument. When Andrea read the folder on her first day with the books, she came to find Carol in the kitchen. "This note at the end," Andrea said. "The work was always the argument. What does that mean?" Carol poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. 32 years ago, she said, someone told Virgil that what he did was subjective. Undocumented. Unreliable. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He didn't argue. He went back to the shop and kept working. He kept the records. He let the outcomes speak. She paused. When the moment came, when 9 written-off machines were running in the fields and an insurance company needed to understand why, the 32 years of work was the argument. Not a presentation. Not a memo. The work itself. Andrea looked at the folder. What if the moment hadn't come? She said. Carol thought about this. I asked him that once, she said. In 1994. I told him that the value of what he knew was the value of the operation, and that when the market learned it, the margin would compress. What did he say? He said the market learned slowly, Carol said. But he also said something else. He said, the work is worth doing regardless of whether anyone is watching. The machines run or they don't. The outcomes are real or they aren't. The validation the work needs is the validation the outcomes provide. She paused. The 2019 flood was when the outcomes were visible enough that someone paying attention could see them. But the outcomes had been real for 32 years. Andrea looked at the folder for a long time. Then she closed it, carefully, and put it at the front of the binder where Carol had placed it. Virgil Mast was 69 years old in the spring of 2024, and the machine shop in Louisville had been operating for 37 years. Trey Soonstrom was running the day-to-day restoration work, assessments, disassembly, cleaning, evaluation, rebuild, testing, with Virgil as the senior advisor on the borderline machines. The ones where the economics were tight and the knowledge was the difference between recovery and pursuit. Trey's assessment accuracy had reached 82% in his 3rd year. Virgil expected 90 within 5 years. Dale Whitmore was regional claims director at Heartland Mutual, where the revised flood damage assessment protocol had been adopted by 3 other agricultural insurance companies in the region following Heartland Mutual's publication of their post-2019 assessment revision. He came to the shop once a quarter. He had been doing this for 4 years. Carol had retired from the formal accounting but still reviewed the quarterly numbers from the house, calling Trey or Andrea with questions that were specific and useful. On an April morning in 2024, Virgil walked through the shop before the day shift started. 3 machines were in various stages of recovery, a Casey 9250 that had been caught in spring flooding in Iowa, a John Deere 9R that had rolled over on a hillside in Missouri, and a Gleaner S98 that had suffered a catastrophic header fire. Each of them had been classified as a total loss by the insurance adjuster. Each of them, in Virgil's assessment, was not. He stopped at the John Deere 9R, the rollover. The cab was destroyed, the front axle bent, the power shift transmission a question mark. Trey had taken the transmission apart on Tuesday. He had found what Virgil expected him to find, the planetary gear sets intact, the housing distorted but the gear sets themselves undamaged. The transmission had absorbed the rollover load through the housing rather than the gear sets. But Trey had also found something Virgil had not predicted, a hairline crack in the secondary planetary carrier, invisible on external inspection, visible only when the carrier was removed and examined under magnification. Trey had brought it to Virgil. Virgil had looked at the crack for a long time. It was at the edge of his experience. He had seen cracked planetary carriers twice in 37 years, and in both cases the crack had been in a different position than this one. The significance of the crack's position for the carrier's structural integrity under operational load was not something the records could tell him directly. "What do you think?" he had asked Trey. Trey had looked at the crack for a long time. "The crack propagation direction is toward the low stress zone of the carrier geometry," Trey said. "If the load path analysis I did is right, the crack would not propagate under normal operating loads. But I've only done load path analysis on paper, not on an actual carrier in operation." "What would it cost to be wrong?" Virgil asked. "A full carrier replacement if the crack propagates," Trey said. "And a customer who thinks we missed something." "What would it cost to be right?" Virgil said. "Nothing," Trey said. "The carrier stays in and the machine runs." Virgil looked at the carrier. He ran his thumb along the crack, feeling the fracture surface, the sharpness of the edges, what the crack told him about whether it was propagating or stable. He had been doing this for 37 years and the crack told him something that the visual examination and the load path analysis could not. The fracture surface was smooth and slightly oxidized, indicating the crack had formed during the rollover impact and had not propagated since. "Replace it," he said. Trey looked at him. "The economics." "Replace it," Virgil said. "Because you're not sure."